Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the fifth of Joseph Pearce's 8-part series on the history of Christendom. The last lecture was delayed because of weather, transportation complications, but we recorded that earlier today. So I doubt anyone in this room has been able to watch it, but within the week we will have part 4 posted. So if you want to go back in time a little bit to catch up on the 11th?
10th, 11th, 12th.
10th, 11th, and...
Sorry, 11th, 12th, 13th.
Yeah, so what many people would call the golden age of Christendom. Please go back and watch it. It's quite interesting. I won't elaborate, but for those of you who are interested in history and who do know a little bit about Catholic history, there are some controversial statements that Joseph makes, and some controversies that he shares with his audience. One of my favorites is, I will talk about this, Joseph and I have actually talked for years about enacting this controversy. It's a great controversy. It's a great debate within Christian history, and it's the debate over Anglo-Saxon England. So just a little teaser for what you missed. Joseph talks about a lecture that Hilaire Belloc gave in Oxford that J.R.R. Tolkien attended. Those of you who know Tolkien, bless you. And those of you who know Tolkien, love Tolkien, know that he was a philologist of Anglo-Saxon, and amongst Catholics, one of the most learned scholars of Anglo-Saxon culture. Belloc was giving a lecture that was the heart of his book on William the Conqueror. Belloc was making the argument that nothing better could have happened to the British Isles than for the Anglo-Saxons to have been knocked out and brought into the ambit of continental Catholic civilization. And Tolkien deeply disagreed with this. And although I think Joseph and I are on the same side, ironically, I suspect that both of us like Belloc as a person more. I don't know that, but like his personality, certainly admire him. But both of us are on the side of Tolkien on this. We've wanted to redo the debate because it's an interesting question, a collision of two elements of Catholic culture. Tonight, Joseph will give us the 14th through the 16th century. So we'll see the unraveling of Catholic culture this evening. And we have a special treat tonight. I believe it's, according to form, that I usually pull a napkin out of my jacket and read some notes. So tonight we have an extra special treat in that we have Dale Ahlquist, who's managed to bring us some warm weather from Minnesota. Many of you, like me, have been very concerned over the past week about the balloon and the great unraveling of, the great exposure of our foreign policy weakness regarding the balloon. Now, I'm very pleased to share with you this evening that I've seen these mock-up, these maps on various news agencies that show Air Force bases, nuclear sites, classified centers, and the balloon's movement over these centers. And I think that's media hype. Because if you overlay the pattern of the balloon with Joseph Pearce's and Dale Ahlquist's lecture circuit, you'll see that, in fact, it's demonstrably certain that the balloon has been following these two experts in Chesterton. Now, if you came tonight, and you did, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting right in front of me. At no charge, you're getting a bonus, because you're going to get Joseph's 5th lecture. But that will be rejoined by Dale's response. So Dale Ahlquist, as I believe everyone knows, is the president of the G.K. Chesterton Society, and the author of many excellent books, and some very interesting forthcoming books on G.K. Chesterton. So we're delighted to have both Joseph Pearce and Dale Ahlquist, who are good friends of the college, and both of them hold honorary doctorates from the college, it should be added, giving us an overview of Catholic history. So thank you for coming this evening. If you missed the prior lectures, they're all online, and without further ado, Joseph for the lecture, and then Dale with the rejoinder.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming to the 5th of these lectures, where we continue our history of Christendom from the time of Christ to the 20th century. And as Dr. Fahey said, this evening we're looking at the 14th to 16th century, Rupture and Reformation. And I'm going to begin with an overview of the 14th century to begin. Our first century. There's no better way of beginning a discussion of the 14th century than the summary and overview offered by the great Catholic historian Christopher Dawson. Quote, "The 14th century was an age of profound social and spiritual change, an age of ruin and rebirth, of apocalyptic fears and mystical hopes. It was the age of the Great Schism and the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. But it was also the age of Dante and Petrarch, of St. Catherine and St. Bridget, an age of poets and mystics and saints. It saw the breakdown of the theocratic order of medieval Christendom and the rise of political nationalism and religious division." Now, one thing about the 14th century which is singular is it is the feminine century par excellence, that the 14th century has a feminine touch, that the most important and most influential saints of the 14th century were women. So we'll begin with St. Bridget of Sweden, who founded the Brigittine order. She's a married woman, and it was after had 8 children. And after her husband died, she founded this religious order. It's a very strict ascetic religious order. And one thing that she had as an influence upon the 14th century was as a peacemaker. So she tried to dissuade King Magnus IV of embarking on a crusade against the pagans of Latvia and Estonia. She tried to persuade Pope Clement VI to use his influence to put an end to the 100 Years' War between England and France. And she also sought to work for Clement VI returning the papacy to Rome. This is a period of the exile of the papacy from Rome to Avignon. And she worked diligently to try to persuade Clement XVI to return to Rome. So this very positive influence that this holy woman had. And another great saint of this period was St. Catherine of Siena, likewise a peacemaker. She did her best to broker peace between Florence and the papacy. And she did her best to, same as St. Bridget of Sweden, to bring the papacy back to Rome and to end the Great Schism, because there's a point at which you have a pope and an anti-pope at the same time, and she did her best to restore unity by supporting the true pope. Catherine of Sweden was a daughter of St. Bridget of Sweden, And after she married a disabled man and was very diligent and loving in supporting him, and after he died, she became a sister of her mother's religious order, and it became a great holy woman in her own right. Elizabeth of Portugal. So all that, it's the astonishing thing for me as regards to saints about the 14th century is it's a feminine century. St. Elizabeth of Portugal, again, what role? That of peacemaker. So she was born as a princess, she marries royalty, and there's a civil war breaks out in Portugal between her husband, who's the king, and her son, who wants to be the king. And again, she works wonders in actually bringing that to a peaceful resolution. There's also at that time a war between Portugal and Castile that she's a great broker of peace between. And she spends the last years, she wanted to become, in the final years of her life, a Poor Clare nun, Poor Clare's sister, and she was dissuaded from doing that, but she nonetheless spent the last years of her life basically living in a Poor Clare convent. So this woman who'd been born into royalty, living out her final years in holy poverty. And then my favourite, I don't know, favourite might not be the right word, quixotically, this person I love, St. Margaret the Barefooted. Who here's heard of St. Margaret the Barefooted? Oh, good, I don't feel quite so ignorant now, because I'd never heard of her either. So I started researching this book. But basically, she was abused by her husband physically, and largely because of the fact that she was trying to live a good and holy life. And she lived obviously a life of holy poverty, as St. Margaret the Barefooted, her title would suggest. Today, she's actually the patron saint of brides, of difficult marriages, because she lived in one. A lot of those around these days. And of victims of abuse. So someone who's certainly someone who should be called upon for her intercession, and obviously most of us aren't doing that because none of us have heard of her. So anyway, you now know to add to your litany of prayers for people you know that are in bad marriages, difficult marriages, or brides-to-be, or victims of abuse, to pray to St. Margaret the Barefooted. These great female saints of the 14th century. And we're not even finished there. These two aren't canonised, but are favourites of mine. Obviously, I'm English, so Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Knowledge. Now, in England, England is a relatively small country. I looked at the terms of land area. If we had lots of time and lots of fun here, I could just ask you which state in the United States was closest in land area to England. That would be fun, but it would take us too much time, so I will just tell you. But I looked it up, and the state in the United States that's closest in land area to England, not Scotland, by the way, just England, right? There's a difference, is North Carolina. So that's how big England is. My last 13 years living in England, and my first 12 years, so as a child and last 13 years when we moved over here, was spent in East Anglia, Suffolk in the middle of East Anglia, Norfolk in the north. Both of these holy women came from Norfolk. So if the whole of England is the size of North Carolina, Norfolk's the size of, I don't even know, whatever the local county is, if it's small enough. So this is what I consider home. So Marjorie Kemp wrote sort of mystical memoirs, and her book, her memoirs are very, very important to historians of the period. She talks about difficulties in marriage, she talks about pilgrimages to various places. She also has a wonderful scene during the Black Death, essentially the Black Death of, she gives a depiction of a priest walking through the town with the Blessed Sacrament to minister to the dying, and the people in the town all kneeling as the Blessed Sacrament came past, and the quality of the candles was so inferior that a local guild actually that became their purpose, was to make sure that whenever the Blessed Sacrament was carried through the town, there would be candles that were suitable for the occasion to to accompany it. So we have all this from her. And there's another just across that she's in King's Lynn, which is a small town in the west of Norfolk, and about 45 miles from that is the other end of the county is Norwich, and Julian of Knowledge, who was a mystic from the late 14th century, and she had visions of Christ, and she was walled up in a cell where there was no door to the outside at all. There was just merely a small opening through which she could be given food, and also that small opening allowed her to view Mass in the church every day. So she became this sort of anchorite, this hermit, who was very much seen as a holy woman. Her place became a shrine from the late 14th century onwards until it was destroyed by Henry VIII, which is probably where we'll be ending up in this talk. And also this time, by this stage, and towards the end of my last talk, I talked about the apparition of Our Lady of Walsingham in 1061 at the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. I talked about Anglo-Saxon England going out like a supernova. You know, a supernova is the star is brighter, the brightest ever when it's about to die. Well, the last 5 years of Anglo-Saxon England, we had a saint on the throne, St. Edward the Confessor, and we had this holy apparition of Our Lady of Walsingham, which became the major Marian shrine of medieval Europe. And so by this stage, by the 14th century, there are thousands and thousands of pilgrims going to Walsingham from all over Christendom. There's certain set rates, and I used to think, that Walsingham, if you look at a map of England, if you know England at all, you can visualise the map. Where London is in England, then there's this pregnant lump above England to the east, right? England's like a pregnant woman. The top of that pregnant lump is Walsingham. So it is Norfolk. And I used to think, it's 100 miles from London. How do people from the continent get there? Of course, because I was dumb. Norwich was the second largest city in England at the time because of the textile trade, the wool trade. And it's across the North Sea from Belgium and what have you, was often tracked, and they're the closest to Walsingham, if you go by sea from Europe, is about 15 miles to the north. So people they wouldn't have to necessarily walk, get to London and then walk 100 miles. And they could actually sail and walk as little as 15, depending on what pilgrim route they took. But it's huge. Marian shrine. England on the edge of Christendom, but nonetheless is this shrine. It gives some idea about Our Lady Queen of Peace. The 14th century, England was obviously at war with France, the 100 Years' War we mentioned already. The Duke of Brittany, so a Frenchman, was a prisoner of war. The King of England actually paid money so the Duke of Brittany could make a pilgrimage to Walsingham with his knights. So this is even in the midst of war, the Queen of Heaven can bring enemies together. And the other country that England was fighting throughout the 14th century was Scotland. So King David II asked permission to go on pilgrimage from Scotland to Walsingham, which is actually quite a long way, and I don't know if they sailed, but I presume they did. I don't know. And then his son, Robert the Bruce, who was the victor of the greatest ever victory of the Scots over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, which I think was 1314, he also asked permission to go on pilgrimage. So, actually to go to an enemy country, to go on pilgrimage to the Mother of God. This is the power of the Blessed Virgin and the power of that shrine. Then in 1381, there was the Peasants' Revolt in England, and it's nearest England. Well, it's not necessarily true. But it was certainly a period when England rose in revolution against injustice, the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, and there was a 14-year-old king on the throne in England at the time, Richard II. And it looked as if the rebels were going to win. The king had to basically go to the rebels and parley for peace. And he went to a Marian shrine in London, and he knelt before that Marian shrine and offered England as Our Lady's dowry. In other words, offered England to the Blessed Virgin. And that became a title for England thereafterwards, Our Lady's Dowry, which has stayed with the country. During COVID, by the way, England was dedicated again by the bishops as Our Lady's Dowry to reiterate that. So this is the good, right? And you see, it was overwhelmingly feminine. Overwhelmingly feminine. These from the Queen of Heaven, and then these saints and these other women. Okay, but in every century, this is the theme, as you know, of this lecture series: good, bad, beautiful. So what was bad that was going on in the 14th century? Well, there was the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, so of Islamic imperialism in Europe, and this took the role particularly of the invasion of Europe from the south, so that by the end of the 14th century, the whole of Europe south of the Danube, what used to be called Yugoslavia, so Serbia and Croatia and these countries had all basically fallen under Muslim control. So this is the rise of Islamic imperialism into the heart of Europe. There's the Black Death. Now, we had COVID recently, and that was almost as scary as the balloon that's gone over recently. That was controversial. But the Black Death, which struck Europe during the 14th century, estimates are between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population killed. That's a serious plague. So you got these natural plagues, you got Islam, and then you have the Avignon papacy. That the papacy leaves Rome and moves to Avignon in southwest France. And the suspicion was that this meant that the papacy was in the pocket of the French king. And I give the figures in my book. I don't have it now, but basically just about every bishop appointed by the popes during the 70 years of the Avignon papacy, 90% of the bishops appointed were Frenchmen. So if you're tempted to think that the church is in a bad way at any particular moment in history, like our own particular time, for instance, then learn history. And then we get to the beautiful. Of course, by the way, that got worse. The Avignon papacy wasn't bad enough. When the Pope, largely due to or at least partly due to these wonderful female saints, returned to Rome, then they set up an anti-pope, an alternative pope in Avignon. So now you have the true pope in Rome and the anti-pope in Avignon. And this was called the Great Schism. Now, 2 popes, and at one point there were 3 popes, because they also elected one in Pisa. So 3 people claimed to be pope, right? You think there's confusion in the church? And again, the third part in every century, of course, is the beautiful. And the 14th century is the beginning of modern art, in the sense that Giotto was the first modern artist, an element of naturalism, as opposed to iconography, where irrespective if you think that's good or bad, that's a whole different discussion. But Giotto, in many ways, the father of the Renaissance in art. This is his heyday. He's lauded, amongst other things, by Dante as being this giant. Dante was a contemporary of Giotto. So we also have, of course, the 14th century, we have Dante's Divine Comedy, which is arguably the greatest work of literature ever written, and the finest fruit of the Middle Ages. In England, we have Chaucer, often called the father of English poetry, sometimes the father of the English language. And just a little quick aside on that, again, that after the Norman conquest that Dr. Fahey mentioned, and the discussion in the previous lecture about it, the language of the people was Anglo-Saxon, Old English as we would now call it. The language of the aristocracy was French. The language of the scholar was Latin. So you had sort of 3 languages going on here. And it was actually not until the 14th century, the first time that the opening of Parliament was actually given in English, not French. So that we're talking about 300 years after the Norman conquest. The language of the ruling class was different from the language of the common people. And a large part of this popularizing of the English language was Chaucer. And because although he was a Londoner, and therefore was involved with the court, and obviously could speak French fluently and Latin well and what have you, he chose to write in English. As Dante, by the way, had chosen to write in Italian, right? It's the vernacular. So at the same time as that, we have the wonderful poem Sir Gawain the Green Knight, which is translated into modern English by Tolkien. And again, whereas you can read, anybody with a little modicum of effort can read Chaucer. Just take a little bit of effort. The Sir Gawain the Green Knight poem is in older English, because Chaucer's sort of this bridge. That's why he's called the father of the English language, or father of English poetry, between the melding of the two languages, which we now know. So in English, for instance, you could say freedom or liberty, right? The Freiheit, the German, or liberty, the French. The Sir Gawain the Green Knight was written at the same time, contemporary, much harder to read because it's written in the English vernacular, not the language of London. William Langland, Piers Plowman's from this period, so a golden age of English literature at this time. And the final thing I want to talk about the beautiful, because it's a favourite work of art of mine, and I'm obviously showing my national bias, for which you'll forgive me because you're good Christians. One of my favourite works of art is the Wilton Diptych, which you can find in the National Gallery in London. And it's a diptych, so just two different painters side by side, hinged. On the left, as you look at it, is King Richard II on his knees in prayer. Behind him are three saints: St. John the Baptist, who's his own personal patron saint, and the two patron saints of England, St. Edward the Confessor, we've mentioned already. There was the king at the time of the Norman Conquest. Well, actually, no, he died just before. At the time of the Marian apparition at Walsingham, and St. Edmund the Martyr, who I haven't mentioned anything about here. They were the two patron saints of England. The Crusaders brought back a devotion to St. George. So St. George became the patron saint, but that's a little bit after this. So the two patron saints of England, St. Edward the Confessor, St. Edmund the Martyr, and St. John the Baptist, his personal patron saint, on his knees in armour. And the other side of the other panel, is the Blessed Virgin Mary holding the Christ child with a company of angels behind. It's beautifully coloured. It's just very, very bright, very medieval. And this is the moment when he's on his knees in front of the Blessed Virgin in prayer, giving England to the Virgin as Our Lady's dowry. It's a wonderful work of art. So that's going to end the 14th century. 15th century. First of all, there was a great revival in the 15th century, and particularly in popular piety, so grassroots revival. And a lot of it's connected to, there's a particular emphasis on the passion of Christ and on suffering. So there's a lot of devotions to the sorrows of Mary, to the crucified Christ. Art has, the crown of thorns, the crucifixion, the carrying of the cross. And of course this is connected. First of all, we have the Black Death of the previous century. We have a lot of bad things happening in the world. Surprise, surprise, what's new? The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis was the best-selling work of popular piety at the time, and it's one of the best-selling books of all time. It comes from this time. But as regards the resurrection of Rome, the resurrection of the papacy, after the ignominy of the previous century, with the Avignon papacy and then the three popes, in 1450 there was a Jubilee year announced, and the number of people that visited Rome exceeded all estimates and all hopes, so that the Pope actually had to reduce the minimum number of time that pilgrims had to be in Rome to qualify for the indulgence, because there was no room. There were campsites. All the vineyards have been used as campsites. Every open space was campsites. There was no room at the inn, literally. And the Pope had to reduce the number of days people had to stay, because they needed to get people out of there, because so many people were trying to come. So this is the resurrection of Rome, the 1450 Jubilee year. There's a Franciscan Revival in the 15th century, also two most notable saints being St. Bernardine of Siena and St. John of Capistrano, St. Juan Capistrano. And these were street preachers. They would walk around Italy and beyond on foot and just speak, no microphones, none of this, and win countless converts to the faith. And then the final one, St. Juan of Capistrano, by the way, when he was 70 years old, fought in fight. He was the spiritual presence, the chaplain to the army, the Hungarian army that defeated the Turks, the Muslims at the Battle of Belgrade. So also a crusader in the best sense of the word. And then there was also a lesser known saint, also a Franciscan, Saint Colette. And she established these Franciscan communities at that time. So this is a great time, 15th century. And this is the whole thing. Chesterton talks in The Everlasting Man, the 6 deaths of the faith, that the Catholic Church is always dying. There are several times in its history you can say, well, basically, the Catholic Church is dead. The Catholic Church always rises from the dead, as Chesterton says, because it worships the God who knows the way out of the grave. There's a perfect example. 15th century, after the various things of 14th century, the scandal of the papacy, great time of religious revival. Okay, but we also have the bad. This was the time of the Great Schism, when there were 3 popes. It was ended at the beginning of the century in 1417 with the Council of Constance, where they basically deposed the 2 anti-popes, persuaded the true pope to resign, and elected a new pope. In terms of philosophy, I must admit this is talk about what great things happen in my country, the English bias. I have to also confess the bad things that happen in my country, and 2 of the worst things that of the 15th century emanated in England, philosophically and theologically. So philosophically was William of Ockham. William of Ockham is sort of his philosophy known as nominalism, which was really it was the deconstruction of scholasticism and really the foundation of relativism. So the William of Ockham's nominalism enters the philosophical discussion with ultimately very destructive consequences. And also in the 15th century in England is John Wycliffe, who's a proto-Protestant, 100 years before the Protestant Reformation. And actually, his followers were known as Lollards in England, and they got very little support, largely because they were very militantly opposed to the belief in the real presence of the Blessed Sacrament. And they were, for instance, they would actually disrupt Mass at the time of the consecration by insulting the idolatry of the transubstantiation. And the English had such a love for the Blessed Sacrament that actually rebounded against them. But in Hungary, in what is now the Czech Republic, in Bohemia, a disciple of John Wycliffe, John Huss, led a much more successful rebellion against the church. When that was put down politically, not necessarily theologically, in other words, the ideas continued, he was executed. And at the same time as he was executed, Joan of Arc was executed. Now here's something rather interesting, right? So I want to read what Ronald Knox says about St. Joan of Arc. Bear in mind that she's basically put to death at the behest of a very corrupt French court acting really under duress from the English. So she's dying, she's being burned alive, believing that she's failed. Right? All the visions she's got, they haven't materialized. She's lost. Her cause is lost. And yet she dies with great faith. And this homily, this sermon by Ronald Knox is wonderful, and I wanted to just read it, or part of it. She was to deliver France. The voices had told her so. And France was not yet delivered. And so she went to the stake, her hopes still unfulfilled, but never doubting for an instant that the voices were true. 5 years later, the king entered Paris. 22 years later, England had no possessions left on French soil. She believed he was faithful who had promised. She could not foresee that her unjust condemnation would be reversed, point by point, 25 years after her death. She could not foresee that nearly 500 years after her death, France would receive the tidings of her canonization by the tribunal to which in life she never ceased to appeal, the tribunal of the Holy See. But she believed that he was faithful who had promised. And that's beautiful. It's beautiful English. Someone who's martyred, who in a worldly sense has failed, but didn't lose faith. Knew that he had promised. Of course, she goes to heaven and she can see it all happen afterwards, but when she's burning. This is what I say in the paragraph afterwards, quoting Ronald Knox further. Such faith in the midst of such tribulation, such faith in the promises of Christ, even in the absence of any tangible evidence that the promises will be kept. It was such faith that had earned St. Joan of Arc her heavenly reward. Inspired by such faith, Ronald Knox ended his sermon in honour of the saint with heartfelt hope. Quote, "Whither may God of his great mercy bring us, that we may see with open vision among the choir of virgins that are Our Lady's handmaids, the saint whose glorious merits the Church commemorates today." It's obviously given this homily on her feast day. And Knox's words remind us that the saints always triumph over evil, even in the most tragic circumstances, christening their wild worst best. That's to quote 3 words of Manny Hopkins. Christening their wild worst best by uniting themselves to Christ. Okay, where are we now? 1453. What's going on that's bad in the world? Apart from burning of saints by the French and the English, there's the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The fall of the eastern lung, if you like, of Christendom. And by this time, Constantinople was so corrupt that the very few people of Constantinople, even only about 5,000 of the population fought to defend the city. Most of those defending it were Christians from the West, heroically dying in a last charge reminiscent of something you might expect in The Lord of the Rings. But Harry Crocker says in his book Triumph, the Turk had finally crushed enfeebled Byzantium. The Catholic West would prove hardy as stock. And then I talk about this one episode, which I find very inspiring. The difference between the decadence of Byzantium and the hardier character and culture of the Catholic West was evident in 1480 when the southern Italian city of Otranto was attacked by the Turks. The city fell after a 15-day siege. Upon reaching the cathedral, the Turks found the archbishop fully vested and with a crucifix in his hand. He was beheaded. The priests that were with him were also slain and the cathedral desecrated. Then all the women and older children were rounded up to be sold into slavery. Older men, younger children, and all infants were killed. It is thought that around 12,000 people were killed and around 5,000 women and older children sold as slaves. 800 able-bodied men were rounded up and told that they would be spared if they converted to Islam. In response, a tailor by the name of Antonio Primaldi stepped forward and proclaimed that since Christ had died for Christians, it was fitting that Christians should die for Christ. At these words of defiant faith, the other captives cheered. Witnessing the subsequent execution of these Christian martyrs, which began with the beheading of Antonio Primaldi, it is said that one of the Muslims converted on the spot and was killed instantly by his companions. The Otranto martyrs were beatified by Pope Clement XIV in 1771, but were not canonized until 2013. Pope Benedict XVI issued a decree in 2007 recognizing that Primaldi and his companions had been killed out of hatred for their faith. In 2012, he authorized the Congregation for the Causes of Saints to promulgate a decree regarding the miraculous healing of a religious sister, Francesca Levote, which was attributed to the intercession of Blessed Antonio Grimaldi and his companions. Then on February 11th, 2013, the day on which he announced his resignation, Pope Benedict also announced the date for the canonization of the Otranto martyrs. They were canonized by the newly elected Pope Francis 3 months later. Further evidence of the hardier character of the Christian West was revealed 12 years after the Otranto massacre, when a Spanish army to the city of Granada, the last bastion of Islam in Western Europe. The liberation of the Iberian Peninsula from the grip of Islam secured the victory of Christendom on the Western Front of its centuries-old conflict with its old enemy. In the same year, 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the New World of the Americas, opening up a whole new Western frontier and beginning a whole new chapter in the history of Christendom. So the beautiful in the 15th century, the Renaissance. Because when the Renaissance begins, and we don't have obviously much time to talk about the Renaissance under the circumstances, it deserves a lecture in itself, evidently. But I'll begin this section on the beautiful in my manuscript book to come. If the 13th century had been the age of Gothic architecture and the great cathedrals, the 14th century the age of the divine poets, the 15th century will be the age of the great artists of the Renaissance. They are so many in number that we can only offer a tantalizing glimpse of their multifarious works, which I do in the book. Here I'm just going to mention their names. So Masaccio, his Madonna and Child, his Expulsion from Paradise, Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi, and again, we could carry on, and we will carry on in a moment because the greatest I haven't mentioned yet. But there's something else that happens at this time which is both good and bad. It's all beautiful. This is a paradox. It could be said that the Renaissance loses its virginity, its divine innocence and purity, when it loses the Virgin in its pursuit of Venus. This aesthetic and erotic fall does not divorce art from beauty. However, as can be seen by the magnificence of Botticelli's Primavera and his Birth of Venus. In both works, the goddess takes the place of the Mother of God as the centre of focus, pregnant and bounteously beautiful in the former painting and nakedly and erotically alluring in the latter. And yet Botticelli's Pieta is one of the most sorrowfully glorious of all religious arts. The muscular dead body of the clean-shaven Christ draped dramatically across the lap of his mother, who appears to be almost fainting with grief, while being supported and surrounded by saints and holy women. I said I haven't mentioned the greatest. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, is from this period, and I'm not going to say much about him because we don't have a lot of time, and if you don't know about him, you need to. And I'll leave it there. So we're going to finish now with about the 16th century. It's going to be a summary because it needs to be. But actually, I should say about the 15th, that Filippo Brunelleschi's Dome of Florence Cathedral, absolute work of magnificence that still is astonishing 600 years later for its achievement in terms of just architectural genius. 16th century. The most important thing about the 16th century, it was not the century of the Reformation. It was a century of 3 reformations, one of which was good and the other 2 of which were bad. Let's begin with the good. The Catholic Reformation, which was a response to the Protestant rupture. So the Council of Trent is at the heart of that, the Tridentine Reformation, what the Council of Trent brought to the church. It brought, first of all, the fighting spirit back to Catholicism. It made Catholicism once more what it always is, but seems to forget it sometimes, the church militant, the church at war against the city of man, the city of God in the midst of the city of man, in enemy territory. So we have Ignatius of Loyola, St. Francis Xavier, the founders of the Jesuits, and the spread of the Jesuit order around the world. We have St. Philip Neri in Rome, St. Charles Borromeo, in Milan, and we could say much more about both of those saints and should. St. Pius V, that great holy pope in the midst of this century, who amongst other things called the Holy League to defeat the Muslim fleet, the Battle of Lepanto, and in thanksgiving for that declared October the 7th to be the Feast of Our Lady of Victory. And when the Catholic Church got too bashful about talking about victory, we softened it to Our Lady of the Rosary. That's also fine. And if that battle had not been won, if we hadn't had that Holy Pope in place, it's quite possible that St. Peter's in Rome would be as Hagia Sophia is in Constantinople, it would be a mosque. So thanks be to God for St. Pius V. It's a period of great religious revival and reform in the religious orders, especially perhaps the Carmelites, with St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross belongs in both the good section of the history of this century and the bad section, because if you know how abysmally he was treated by his own order. He was whipped, he was imprisoned in solitary confinement in a tiny cell with virtually no light coming in. So he had to stand on a chair to get during the small part of the day when there was natural light coming in so he could actually read his breviary for months. And they still didn't let him out. He escaped. So corruption within the church. It's always the Judas is as much of an enemy as Pontius Pilate and Herod in the history of the church. Of course, probably the most important thing, in 1061, the most important thing perhaps in the whole history of the 11th century was the apparition of Our Lady of Walsingham in England, and obviously in 1531 the apparition of Lady of Guadalupe in the Americas, leading to the mass conversion. And the conversion wasn't happening because of the Spanish, because the Spanish were as much a cause of scandal as anything else. It took divine intervention. It took a gift from heaven. It took the visit of the Blessed Virgin Mother to convert the Native Americans to the church. As regards the bad, it's also at that same time the African slave trade begins, which is an abomination. We don't need to say anything more about it except the fact it's an abomination. The Protestant rupture we've talked about, the Protestant Reformation. And the third Reformation is the English Reformation, which is not a Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII was given the title by the Pope as Fidei Defensor because of his defense of Catholic doctrine against the errors of Luther, particularly defense of the seven sacraments. Henry VIII just really wanted to be his own God and made himself his own God. Could say much more about that, have said much more about that, can't say much more about it now. One of the most heroic moments of the 16th century, which belongs in the good as well as the bad, is the heroic resistance of the English to this imposition of the king's new religion. There was a rising, the Pilgrimage of Grace, right at the beginning in northern England. There was uprisings all over the country when they abolished the Mass during the reign of Edward VI. And there was a rising called the Northern Rebellion during the reign of Elizabeth I. To me, as an Englishman, the most glorious century in English history is the 16th century. The century when Henry VIII rips the faith away from England and the English respond with such heroism. And to finish with the beautiful from that period, and there's so much. So this is the beginning of the second part of the Renaissance, if you like. Raphael, Michelangelo, and of course this is the century of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, El Greco, the building of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. In music, the golden age of polyphony, Palestrina, Thomas Louis de Victoria, and two of the greatest, again I'm showing my patriotism here, Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. And again, these are Catholics living in an England where it's illegal to be a Catholic and punishable by death to be a priest. And here they are being amongst the greatest Catholic composers of that century. St. John of the Cross I've mentioned as a poet now, though, not as a saint. St. John of the Cross's poetry, which is just very important upon my own conversion, actually. That's another story. St. Robert Southwell, the Jesuit poet, and various scenes in Shakespeare are directly attributable to the poetry of Sir Robert Southwell. I'm just mentioning one because of the time scenario here. The graveyard scene in Hamlet, which we all know, alas poor Yorick, I knew him Horatio. Get my skull out, right? Alas poor Yorick, I knew Horatio. A large part of that scene is an intertextual dialogue with St. Robert Southwell's poem Upon the Image of Death. Read the scene and the poem side by side, and you will see it inescapably. And so that means we should end with St. William Shakespeare. But we won't, because William Shakespeare, basically his earliest plays were written in the early 1590s. His greatest plays were written in the first decade of the next century, so he will play a significant role in the next lecture. Thanks so much. As always, God bless you. Bye-bye. I don't know where Dr. Fahey is. Shall I introduce this man? He needs no introduction, but I will do anyway.
I was already introduced, wasn't I?
Huh?
Wasn't I already introduced once?
You always do. I'll do it again anyway. This man is a very good friend of mine. Love him to bits. You are very blessed to have him. And if he disagrees with me, that's the one time he's wrong. Okay. By the way, that's a clean glass, and that's water. Should you want it? Okay.
Oh, great. Why would I want to drink water?
Because there's no wine.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed because I just found out I was supposed to talk a little bit about Thomas More, and I came here prepared to talk about Mary Tyler Moore. And I'm not sure how that mix-up occurred. It could be because I'm from Minnesota, and that's where her television show was set, even though it was never filmed there except for the opening titles. So, are there any questions? We are on the eve of Thomas More's birthday. And of course, he was mentioned briefly in Joseph's remarks, and I'm just going to add a few things and especially give you some Thomas More from the viewpoint of G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton said that all modern historians are divided into two classes: those who tell half the truth and those who tell none of it. Of course, Joseph told half the truth tonight because he only had half the amount of time he was allowed. He would have told the whole truth if he'd had more time. But what he did allude to the fact that that the time when Henry VIII tore the Catholic faith away from England is he says he's proud of that because the Catholics fought back. Most people don't even know that the Catholics fought back. Most people think that Henry VIII brought the Renaissance to England, and gave them the Church of England. They don't ever think about the fact that Westminster Abbey used to be an abbey. There was a Benedictine abbey there, and all the abbeys and monasteries were stolen from the church. Most of them destroyed, reduced to ruins. It was a sign of great aristocratic prestige to have a ruin of a monastery on your estate. If you didn't have a real monastery, you'd build a fake ruin called a folly to show that we used to also have a monastery here too, and the heroism of the Catholics who fought back has mostly been brushed aside by history, and most people don't realize it. And yet there's something about Thomas More that everyone knows, that Thomas More was right and was the hero, and Henry VIII was the villain. Everybody seems to know that. Even an atheist, Robert Bolt, wrote the play A Man for All Seasons, proving that even canonization does not prevent someone from being popular. Because another thing people don't realize about Thomas More is that he wasn't canonized till the 20th century. And Chesterton, he was canonized during Chesterton's lifetime. Chesterton went to Rome in 1929 for the beatification of the English martyrs. It's when he actually met Pope Pius XI, who beatified them. He also met Mussolini while he was there. He says that even Charles Dickens, Chesterton points out, Charles Dickens says Henry VIII was a wicked man, and he calls him a blot of blood and grease upon the history of England. He says, Chesterton says, I've often wondered that no one has made so obvious a parallel as that between the murders of Macbeth and the marriages of Henry VIII. Both Henry and Macbeth were originally brave, good-humored men, better rather than worse than their neighbors, and better rather than worse than their neighbors. Yeah, that's a good line. But both Henry and Macbeth hesitated over their first crime, the first stabbing and the first divorce. Both found out the fate which is in evil, for Macbeth went on murdering and poor Henry went on marrying. And there's only one fault in the parallel. Unfortunately for history, Henry VIII was not deposed. He was, it's good to point out, he was very popular in his early days. He was the young prince of the Renaissance with great accomplishments. But in his last days, he was something of a maniac. He says, Chesterton's got this great line, he says, such strength as Henry VIII had was the strength of a badly trained horse that bolts. You know, that's a great line. I don't know, every time I say that line, I could get a room full of silence. I should learn to, this is the way we silence the room, is with this line. Think about it again. Such strength as Henry VIII had was the strength of a badly trained horse that bolts. Henry VIII bolted. He bolted from the Catholic Church because he was badly trained. It's an interesting point. And here is, I think, Chesterton's most interesting insight into the problem of Henry VIII versus the great virtue of Thomas More. Henry VIII did consider himself more Catholic than the Pope. He was going to run the church according to his own way of doing it because the Pope wasn't running it well enough for his standards. It started really with he didn't think the Pope did enough to chastise Luther. He didn't deal with Luther strong enough, didn't give him the strong arm, which is why he wrote his treatise in the defense of the seven sacraments, lambasting Luther. And the great, there was this controversy between, the writings of Henry VIII attacking Luther and Luther in his response. Chesterton says, the debate between Luther and Henry VIII can hardly be called a serious incident, partly because Luther himself, on this occasion, confined himself almost entirely to the most foul-mouthed personal abuse, and partly because Henry afterwards did everything he could to deserve the abuse. That's a good line. All right. But his point about Henry VIII being more Catholic than the Pope, what was the matter with him was he was that sort of rigid churchman who always does, consciously or unconsciously, want to be the head of the church. There are Catholic laymen in whom their priests will mournfully recognize the type. Everything in the parish church must be absolutely Catholic, but as to what that is, why, I will decide. Now, Thomas More was a layman of exactly the opposite type. He was indeed, in his interior life, intensely sacramental and even ascetic, and his real religion was of the sort that the saint possesses and the saint never parades. He did not make himself his own judge. He did not make himself the judge of the church. He preferred the judgment of the church, not only of himself, but of such things as marriage. More died for the papacy because it was a part of the truth, not because it was his favorite part or to him and his friends a particularly sympathetic or popular part. And this, of course, is profoundly true. The need for the papacy is far more obvious now than it was then. Nevertheless, there is this true relation between the martyr and the doctrine for which he died. That he died not only defending the Pope, but defying the sort of man who wants to be Pope. There is no true Pope who wants to be Pope. And Thomas More dies the death of a traitor for defying absolute monarchy. And yet he dies defending not only the church, but the family. And he defends, his life is a defense of private life as being more important than public life. He was known for his sense of humor that sort of ruled his household. His great line, going up the ladder to the execution, see me safely up, coming down, I can take care of myself. But, he never came down the ladder, says Chesterton. He had done with all descents and downward goings what he had himself had been banished from men's eyes in the manner of his master, who being lifted up shall draw all men after him. And the dark closed over him, and the clouds came between, until long afterwards, the wisdom that can read such secrets, saw him fixed far above our heads like a returning star, and established his station in the skies. It looked at the moment as if Henry had won, just as Joseph was saying in his comments. When a martyr dies, it looks like he's losing. Joan of Arc thought she had died defeated. But as time unrolled, even though there was this new artificial Church of England, which was not a real church, even though at that moment of its creation it really held the same doctrine and everything looked the same, except it wasn't the same. And when they just started going a little bit like this, when they were just a little bit different, if that continues after year, they're far, far apart. And the Catholic Church went through this horrible history of persecution, and yet even as early as the 18th century, people realized that even though when the Catholic Church was still illegal technically, there were great thinkers who realized there was something right about the Catholic Church and wrong about the Church of England. Even Dr. Samuel Johnson, a devout Christian but an Anglican, admitted that the man who leaves the Church of England for the Catholic Church gains something, whereas the Catholic who becomes an Anglican loses something. And then in the 19th century, the Catholics were allowed to openly worship again, build their own churches again. Newman and the Oxford Revival comes along, and then the 20th century with a wave of conversions, the most prominent of which was G.K. Chesterton. And by the way, Dr. Fahey, you totally blew that story on Belloc and Tolkien. You told it all wrong. So it's about 1940. Belloc comes to Oxford to give a lecture. He first finds out who his audience is, and he finds out that they're a bunch of Anglo-Saxon geeks. So he wants to say something that is as controversial as possible, that the Anglo-Saxon geeks will erupt after. And so his thesis that night was that the Anglo-Saxons contributed absolutely nothing to English culture. And the Jesuit chaplain to Oxford, Father Martin Darcy, was sitting there in the back row, and in front of them was this very up and rising Anglo-Saxon scholar. He leaned over to him and said, "Tolkien, aren't you going to say anything?" And Tolkien said, "I would never dare debate Belloc without my notes." It just shows what a mastery Belloc had with any subject. If he decided to take one side, nobody was going to beat him in the argument. And he may not have even believed it himself, but he said that's the point we're going to argue tonight. And what's interesting about that story is that people always ask, if Chesterton ever met Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. The answer is he never did. But at least we could place Belloc and Tolkien in the same room. But we don't know if they ever actually exchanged words. So the story, the Inklings were separate from the Chester Belloc. They were influenced by them, but they never had any interaction with them. So that was just a complete aside. When I went to England the first time in 2002, I had the great privilege of giving a talk at the House of Lords. And one of the two members of the House of Lords, who's Roman Catholic, Lord David Alton, invited me there, and he took me around Westminster and around Parliament. And he brought me into Westminster Hall, where dignitaries lie in state when they're dead, and major events happen there. And he escorted me to the middle of the room. And there on a plaque on the floor in the middle of the room, it says, "On this spot, Thomas More was condemned to death." And he said, "Look around, Dale. There are no references to Henry VIII anywhere in this room." He said, when I brought Mother Teresa in here, she knelt down and she kissed the plaque." And I said, "Well, I missed my chance on that one." And of course, the press were all lined up at one end of the hall to interview her when she was, when she had her moment alone there. Whereas I noticed that that end of the hall was completely empty when I was there. But they went up. She went up to them, and the very first question someone asked was, "Mother Teresa, what would you do about the homeless problem here in London?" And she said, "Well, there's lots of room in this building." The Church of England, as Joseph can well attest, is falling apart. It's been falling apart since its inception 500 years ago. And Pope Benedict, God rest him, created the Anglican Ordinariate. And it's funny because nothing much happened when he set it up, but when he went to England to beatify Cardinal Newman, there was just this explosion of conversions, of people leaving the Anglican Church to become Catholic. As Newman said, to go deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. As I told the class today, Chesterton actually had a corollary to that line. He says to be Protestant it is necessary to have a bad memory. And that's the problem with history, is people have a bad memory. They don't study the story. I was also in England with a friend, and we were at an event at Cambridge, and there was a gentleman wearing an interesting lapel pin. Not as interesting as this G.K. Chesterton lapel pin, but we said, what is that lapel pin? He said, "Well, I'm a member of the St. Justin Martyr Society." What's that? Well, we just go into former Catholic churches and pray. We go into former Catholic churches and pray. Well, that means they go into all the Anglican churches because they're all former Catholic churches. Justin Mortar had nothing to do with English history, but it has something to do with church history. It has something to do with being a witness to the faith, and these Englishmen were martyrs, and that was their great achievement. Chesterton says, you have to have a great sense of joy to be a martyr, and Thomas More had that. And when he was beatified during Chesterton's lifetime, Chesterton said, Thomas More is more important now than he was during his lifetime, and he'll be more important in the future than he is now. And it is because the state continues to attack the church, but it also continues to attack the family. And Thomas More is the saint that defends both the family and the church. All right, you picked a good guy to have your college named after.